My background basically is the Queen paid for my flying training, which was very kind of her, and I started that in 1961 in the Royal Air Force. Went through flying training and then ended up on Vulcans, which was not really where I wanted to be. I joined the Air Force for two reasons. One, to fly day fighter ground attack hunters, which I never did, and to live in different countries around the world, which I never did. My career centred around the, if any of you that know the UK know the A1 that runs up the middle, well, it basically centred around the A1 and off to the left and off to the right a little bit. So I had, I did my first tour after flying training. Flying training, I was one of the first pilots to go through on all jet training on the Jet Provost, and from there on to the Vampire T11, and from there on to the Vulcan. And it was a bit of a big step, I must admit, to go from the Vampire to the Vulcan, but we seemed to get around it somehow with the help of my instructor. Thank God for flying instructors, is what I say. So I did my tour on 617 Squadron, and then on to, as a captain, then on 83 Squadron, and then disappeared off to the Central Flying School to learn how to be a flying instructor. Did some flying instruction at Church Fenton in Yorkshire, and then to CF5 Oxford University Air Squadron in Oxford, and then to a staff job, and then promotion, and then back to the Vulcan again as a check captain. So 9 years on the Vulcan altogether, and it's a bomber. And unlike Bob, I have never dropped anything that hurt anybody. So, I've had the privilege on a couple of occasions of meeting Barnes Wallis. Barnes Wallis, as you know, was probably best known for the development of the bouncing bomb that was used in the Dams raid. We've just passed the 75th anniversary of the Dams raid on the 16th and 17th of May this year, and there are still a couple dam busters still alive. No pilots, but there's still a couple alive, and you'll see one of them on a bit of video later on this. The central players in this story, in fact, are Barnes Wallis on the left, Guy Gibson on the right, the Lancaster bomber, and of course Nigger the dog. Now, in the remake of the Dam Busters, which they've been talking about, and Stephen Fry has done the screenplay for it, and apparently one of his biggest problems was to decide what to call Nigger the dog, because you can't call it Nigger anymore. And, you know, in the end they came up with Nigsy, because apparently Guy Gibson, that was his abbreviated name for it, was Nigsy. So there we are. And one of my jobs, well, you'll see it a little bit later on, but one of my jobs as a junior pilot on 617 Squadron was to look after Nigger's grave, and of course all the other squadrons used to put all sorts of other, anyway. Barnes Wallis, taken about 1943, about the time that all this was happening. He, together with another guy, really developed the geodetic design using light alloy construction for airframes in the aircraft that are listed below there. And you can see how good that is. That's a Wellington returned safely after battle damage. I don't know what happened to the tail gunner, nobody told me.
It's 5 miles from Chesil Beach. You can still find one of the early versions of the bouncing bomb. I've come to Abbotsbury to have a look.
Ah, here it is. This is the prototype bouncing bomb that was used during the trials here at Chesil Beach. But as you can see, it's got these little dimples on it, so it's known as the Gulf Mine. During the trials, they were constantly experimenting with different types of aerodynamics. So some had smooth casing, some were wood, some were steel, some had these dimples like this.
But Wallis wasn't the only one urgently researching new types of weapons. At the Road Research Laboratory, scientists hadn't given up seeking ways to destroy dams. They were experimenting on scale models, trying to establish how much explosive would be needed to cause a breach. In May 1942 came a breakthrough.
The discovery came almost by accident when a scale model was deliberately broken up by placing a charge against the dam wall. What was significant was not where the charge was placed, that was basic physics. The breakthrough came through the combination of using a small amount of charge against the dam wall and underwater.
Crucially, the model had been destroyed using much less explosive than expected. For Wallis, there was new hope that a dam-busting, bouncing bomb could be carried on existing aircraft. His theory gained weight on the 24th of July 1942, when the test was scaled up on a real dam at Nantygrow in Wales. The result was spectacular.
What this meant for Wallis was that it should now be possible to deliver a bouncing bomb capable of destroying the German dams using existing aircraft, namely Lancasters, which were built by Vickers' rival A.V. Rowe.
By the end of January 1943, trials on the prototype confirmed the bouncing bomb could work against ships and dams. Those who saw Wallis's film were impressed, but to many, getting the weapon to its target still seemed a fantastical proposition. Air Vice Marshal Linnell at the Ministry of Aircraft Production was a skeptic. He believed the weapon was unworkable and distracting from Wallis's first priority, crucial development of the new heavy bomber, the Vickers Windsor.
Yeah, target one is the Mona Dam, and with target two the Ada, and the Sorpe Dam, which is a different construction. It's an earth dam rather than a brick wall dam, if you like, and extremely difficult to try and get to that target. You will hear a little bit more of that later on.
But still trials continued. Then, on the 12th of February 1943, Wallis learned that Linnell was moving quickly to get the bomb rejected. Fearing for his project, Wallis now wrote his fateful letter to the spy, Group Captain Fred Winterbottom, a last-ditch appeal to his only friend on the inside with the influence to make an impact. Help, oh help.
Winterbottom didn't reply directly to Wallis, but his response, the next letter in the chain, was a masterpiece of cunning and suggestion which took matters to the very top. He chose to write his letter to Air Vice Marshal Inglis, one of the assistant chiefs of the air staff, and in just a few short paragraphs managed to firstly imply that the Prime Minister's office were interested, which they weren't, and secondly that the Navy was about to steal a march over the RAF and the use of this weapon. But for me, the killer line was when he implies that the Chief of the Air Staff hadn't been fully briefed. This letter might have been to Inglis, but it was for one person and one person only, and that was the most senior Air Force officer in the land, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal.
It was a long shot because Portal had set the current strategy of area bombing. Even worse, other influential forces were gathering against Wallis's bigger bomb, now called Upkeep. Linnell was an old friend and colleague of Arthur Harris and warned him of what was being conspired. Harris was having none of it.
Harris was never known to mince his words, but in this letter to Portal on the 18th of February 1943, he really lets rip with all guns blazing. He talks about panacea mongers running amok in the Ministry of Aircraft Production and points out that the weapon itself exists so far only in the mind of those who invented it. He says that this is just about the maddest proposition as a weapon that we've yet come across, and that's saying something. He then says he's prepared to bet his shirt that nothing will ever come of it. It's pure Harris, but you know what? I think he's got a point. I think if I was Harris and I'd learned that there was talk of 30 of my frontline Lancasters being taken away to carry a weapon that still only existed in the mind of Wallis, I think I'd have been every bit as furious.
Harris immediately assured Linnell he would put a stop to Upkeep. Linnell, in turn, warned Vickers chairman Charles Craven that Wallis was damaging his business interests. Wallis, berated by his boss, resigned. But his earlier plea to Winterbottom had already lit a fuse. As Harris and Linnell moved to shut the project down, Winterbottom's letter to Inglis had reached the man at the top.
When Harris had written his rather outraged letter to Portal on the 18th of February, he had fully expected the Chief of the Air Staff to support him in his views, but he was in for something of a shock. It seems that Winterbottom's letter had done the trick, because by the following day, the 19th of February, Portal had not only been fully briefed, he'd also seen Wallis's film. And so he writes to Harris and says from what he's seen, he feels this project is worth supporting. And then he adds, unless the cinema lies. He does assure Harris that he's only going to take away 3 of his precious Lancasters, but by a week later, on the 26th of February, 3 has become 30. One can only speculate as to how this came about, but I think it was a combination of momentum, the shortness of time, and possibly even the RAF wanting to get one over the Royal Navy. What it does go to show is that this was always about politics and personalities as much as it was about the science. And I think in this extraordinary chain of letters, we have the proof of this.
Incredibly, Portal ordered Linnell to greenlight the project, even though Wallis's larger upkeep had yet to be designed. On Friday the 26th of February, Wallis was summoned up to London by Linnell to discuss a major strike against the German dams. The bouncing bomb was back on. Any attack would have to happen by the full moon in May, and Wallis's weapon would have to be ready in just 2 months. Could this be done? He was asked bluntly. Yes, Wallis replied, it could.
I've often wondered whether Barnes Wallis ever truly believed he could deliver what he'd promised. The weapon he was proposing still only existed in his mind, and he didn't yet know what it would take to modify the Lancaster so that it could carry and deliver the upkeep to the target. As he stepped out of the Ministry of Aircraft Production here on Millbank, one can only imagine what must have been going through his mind. Somehow, he had to make good his words, and in just 8 weeks.
That's Gibson and Maudsley sitting in the CO's office of 617 Squadron, exactly the same office that my boss was seated in when I met him first of all. I think even the curtains were the same. I don't think nothing much changed at all. I know the inbox and outbox was wooden things like they are on the desk there, so I don't think anything had changed very much. One of the things I did have the privilege of, though, was actually looking at items of the squadron history, and but that's really a separate talk.
Barnes Wallis faced a race against the clock to produce a working bomb from a primitive prototype. He was confident in his calculations, but no weapon of scale had ever been developed in so short a time. The clock was also ticking for Bomber Command. A new special squadron had to be formed at RAF Scampton, and in record quick time. They were to train for a mission, but would not be told the target, delivering a weapon that didn't yet exist. The plan was to fly from Lincolnshire, across the North Sea, below the German radar at just 100 feet. The target was the dams at the head of the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Germany. The primary targets were the Möhne, the Sorpe, and Germany's largest dam, the Eder. These were the pride of the Reich. Wing Commander Guy Gibson was the man chosen to lead the mission. He alone was told the targets.
Guy Gibson was a hugely experienced bomber and night fighter pilot, a man who always led from the front and who exuded confidence and determination. He was also a more complex character than has often been portrayed. When he took over 617, he had just finished an 11-month stint commanding 106 Squadron and was exhausted both physically and mentally. The pressures of command were absolutely immense. It's easy to forget that Gibson was still only 24.
Operational planning often took Gibson away from Scampton, and he still had his own training to fit around the demands of his new command. This combination of absence and strict discipline earned him a reputation for being distant and aloof.
I don't think Gibson was actually bothered with non-commissioned ranks. He did draw that line of distinction between officers and NCOs and other ranks.
Sergeant Johnny Johnson joined the Dambusters Squadron as a bomb aimer. He was one of the first to arrive in late March. I'm taking him back to number 2 hangar, where Gibson and his staff ran the squadron.
Well done, Johnny. Well done. And that's wonderful.
So this is the old place.
Yeah.
My God.
It's often thought that Gibson handpicked every pilot and crew. It's not true. Johnny Johnson's pilot was Joe McCarthy. An American, he was one of only 4 pilots known personally to Guy Gibson.
Dad said he received a phone call from Gibson and asked him if he would come for a new squadron for one mission, and told him to bring as much of his crew as possible.
McCarthy's crew had just finished a tour of 30 operations and were due leave. Johnny Johnson had planned his wedding for the break, but Gibson had cancelled all leave. Johnson's wedding plans were in ruins. Outraged, Joe McCarthy went to see Gibson with Johnny and crew in tow.
So the last time you were here was in March 1943?
That's right, yeah. That's right.
Amazing.
And if you can imagine, apart from Gibson at his desk over there, 7 of us in here as well.
All lined up along here like this?
A bit crowded, a bit crowded. And Gibson said, what's it all about? From my point of view, it was going to be bloody murder if we didn't get any leave. So then Joe said to the wing commander, I suppose in his typical American style, we've just finished our first tour. We're entitled to a week's leave. My bomberman was supposed to be getting married on the 3rd of April, and he's going to get married on the 3rd of April. We got 4 days, so that was it.
Johnny's honeymoon would have to wait.
That was my only personal association with Gibson. He seemed to have great difficulty in getting down to talking to people below his rank. So we didn't see much of him as NCOs at all. But he was, at that stage, one of the most, if not the most, experienced bomber pilots in the Air Force. And I think his real leadership came to the fore when he took over this new squadron, because he got everything that he wanted for that squadron.
And it wasn't just airmen Gibson needed.
I mean, the 7 crew, they're the cutting edge of the weapon, but behind it all is a vast support team. You can liken it to a Formula One team, where no matter how good the driver, he's basically only as good as his pit crew.
To keep one Lancaster flying, as well as aircrew, there's the parachute packer, the meteorologist, and the flight controller. The bomb train, the flight maintenance crew, the aircraft mechanics, the mobile workshop, and the petrol bowser. That's 500 people thrown together to form a brand new squadron.
Okay, squad.
Incredibly, it was managed, just about, in 1 week, an unprecedented effort. But that was only the start. Operation Chastise, as the raid would be known, demanded a completely new approach to flying. Low level, at night, over water, and dropping a bomb with extreme precision. They had just 6 weeks to perfect this.
For those of you who've seen the 1955 film, The Dam Busters, we know with Guy Gibson in a theatre and spotlights on a performer on stage, and that gave him the idea of the spotlights for height judgment over the water. Not true, all came from Benjamin Lochspeiser.
Steady. Up a bit. Up a bit more. Steady. 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 Hold it now. Hold it. Hold it. This is bloody dangerous.
As a poultry farmer doing his best in the food crisis, I wish to protest against the stupid young men who indulge in idiotic joyriding at all hours of the night. It may be good fun for them. It may be good fun for them. But I would point out that every time they come over our poultry houses, my hens lay premature eggs that drop off the perches and mess up the floor. This means a serious loss to both me and the country.
Sir! You've picked up something here.
You were right about that tree. We did take the top off.
Well, I know where it came from. I suppose you better send it back.
You can see how big it is. It weighed about 5,000 pounds, because that's the weight that they talked in then. They hadn't converted over to kilograms. Filled with Torpex, torpedo explosive, which is a mixture of TNT and other lots of nasty things, with 3 fuses in the side. And you can see a better picture of it here. If you go to the RAF Museum at Bull Creek, they very recently, in fact, had through a guy called Richard Rust, I think, managed to get hold of drawings. Believe it or not, the drawings for the bouncing bomb, which Barnes Wallis invented, no longer exist, and they actually used the drawings that the Germans had made of the one bomb that came off of Barlow's aircraft when he was crossing the coast and hit power lines, and the aircraft crashed and the bomb broke free. So the Germans pounced on it and measured it and took drawings of it and everything else, and those are the drawings that were used to produce this replica bomb, which is, well, I presume it's replica, that's in the RAF Museum at Bull Creek. And if anybody can tell me what the X-17 is on the side, then Richard Rust would really like to know. He thought that maybe that indicated that it was a live weapon. The Lancasters were modified, the mid-upper turret was removed, and a device fitted underneath so that the bomb rotated backwards at something like 500 RPM. If you can just imagine the gyroscopic effect of that, when you're trying to manoeuvre an aeroplane at 60 feet above the water, when you've got a wingspan of 102 feet on the Lancaster at night, it's a pretty daunting prospect. Interesting little story. This is Mickey Martin. Mickey Martin was the low-level expert Gibson had on his team. And one of the things about Gibson was he was extremely good at delegating. He would turn around and say, "You're the expert, the low-flying expert, you sort it out." So he sorted out, Mickey Martin sorted out all the low-level training for the crews, the 19 crews on 617 Squadron. As a slight aside, I was there at RAF Scampton in 1967 when they had the 24th anniversary of the Dams raid. Now, why they had the 24th, and I've no idea, but it was the 24th, and various people were there, including Barnes Wallis and Mickey Martin. And my wife, it was a cold day in Lincolnshire. It's always a cold day in bloody Lincolnshire. My wife was standing beside the Lancaster with a sheepskin coat on, and this guy rushed up and said, "Here, hold this." And it was a big camera. And so she said, "Oh, sure, righto." And so she held it, and then a couple of people came out of the Lancaster, and this guy reappeared, and he said, "Follow me." So up the steps and into the Lancaster, up to the front, and he said, "Thanks for that," and took the camera off of Brenda, and then said, "All right, you can start the interview now." And she said, "Oh, right, well," she turned to Mickey Martin, who was sitting in the pilot's seat, and said, "Well, perhaps you can just describe your experience on the raid." Now, this recording is not that particular one, but it is probably as close to it as we're going to get.
We were in waves of 3 aircraft, separated by about 5 minutes. When the dam loomed ahead out of the moonlight, Gibson swung straight into attack and I saw him settle down on the eastern end of the dam and running toward the dam wall. He slowly lowered himself onto the water and settled at a height of 60 feet and adjusted his airspeed to 240 to ensure that the bomb performed in its characteristic way. He shot across the wall of the dam, the bomb detonated, and a tremendous fountain of water rose to a height of about 700 or 800 feet. This slowly subsided. It took some minutes, and when it had cleared, we could see that the dam wall was still visible and hadn't broken. The next aircraft was ordered into attack. This was Hopgood. Again, he swung round to the east, but unfortunately, just as he approached the dam, some flak hit him. And I think somebody must have been wounded in the aircraft because the weapon came off late and detonated the other side of the wall. We then made our run and dropped our weapon all right, and but unfortunately too, as we went through, or fortunately really, the fire hit our starboard wing, but didn't pull us down. Next two aircraft attacked, and as the final weapon went down, dropped by Maltby, one saw the whole thing go. A great sort of watershed, waterspout of water, not only went vertically but went horizontally. And it was obvious the dam was broken, and we swung for home. And we arrived back about dawn and went to debriefing, and eventually drifted over for food and then into the bar. And of course, as the day wore on, the flight time remaining for all the aircraft ran out. Only 11 of the aircraft managed to get back, and eventually we concluded that those who hadn't come in by then were lost. Almost a sort of state of tears and laughter. One was jubilant about the success of the attack, and of course naturally desperately sorry about the losses. But this was war.
19 Lancasters, 11 returned, each had a crew of 7. And those in red failed to return, those in black returned. Hopgood's was particularly tragic because not only was he hit by flak, but when the bomb was dropped, the detonation of the bomb further damaged the wing of the aircraft such that it couldn't fly any longer and it crashed. There were 2 survivors in that. There were 3 that got out, but only 2 survived the crash. Pretty good really that they've managed to rustle up photographs of everybody. Some are better than others, but of everybody that was on 617 and on Operation Chastise. I had the privilege of meeting Fred Tees at the 24th anniversary of the raid, and he was the rear gunner, and he'd swapped with the front gunner. That's right, he'd swapped with Strange because it was something to do with leg length and what the bomb aimer had problems with legs hanging down in front of him and things while he was operating the site, which we'll see a little bit later on. So they swapped, and Fred survived and Strange didn't. Okay, that's the Mona Dam before and as it is today after the raid. The Ada Dam, and one of the few pictures we've got of Gibson and Nigger and some of the guys. We think this was actually 106 Squadron, not 617. A few questions come up, in fact, and that's why Bomber Command never followed up the dams raid when they were repairing, because the Germans moved in something like 20,000 labourers to repair the dams after the raid, and most of the scaffolding used was timber and the rest of it. I mean, a few well-placed bombs and incendiary bombs would have delayed them even further, but nobody can understand why there were no follow-up attacks. 617 Squadron office buildings, which you saw on the video, and Nigger's Grave, which didn't have a fence around it when I was there. And actually the flowers are slightly better than the flowers that I put in when I was there. The lettering was also better when I was there. Hero Barnes Wallis, and that was taken on that day, on the 24th anniversary. Great man, and that's his grave in Effingham in Surrey. Guy Gibson. Guy Gibson, after the Dams raid, was basically isolated from operational flying. He was given a task of writing a book, Enemy Coast Ahead, which I'm sure some of you have read. And he also was whizzed off to America and basically paraded around, but he badgered and badgered to get back onto operational flying. He was flying a Mosquito in the Pathfinder role and was shot down. And various historians have analysed the records and everything afterwards, and there is absolutely no record of him being shot down by anti-aircraft fire. On his deathbed, Sgt Bernard McCormack confessed that as the rear gunner of a Lancaster, he reckons he shot down Gibson's Mosquito. If you look at the pictures of a Junkers 88 and you look at the picture of a Mosquito, there are many similarities. And in the dark at night when you're frightened, you know, something like a Junkers 88 comes up behind you and you're going to open fire. Well, I probably would. So Gibson and his navigator, Jim Warwick, are buried at Steenbergen in Holland. The end of that.